Hi, I'm Olivia, and today's happy nugget comes from Louis Braille, the 19th century French educator and inventor of the Braille system of reading and writing for people who are blind. Louis Braille was born in France in 1809. His father was a renowned harness maker who earned the title of Master Harness Maker when he was 27. The agrarian society of the early 19th century depended on horses. A harness maker was a man of stature in the farming community who made leather tack, collars, straps, and bridles. Louis's father strived for perfection in his trade, delivering only work that stood up to the highest standards. As a toddler, Louis loved to help his father in his workshop. When Louis was 3 years old, he sat beside his father, trying to imitate him, when he lost control of a sharp, curved leather tool, puncturing his right eye. The medical knowledge of the time could not save Louis's right eye, and although his left uninjured eye could have been saved today, Louis's left eye became inflamed, and in a horribly painful process, by the time Louis was 5 years old, he was completely blind. Blind people in 19th century France were generally considered second-class citizens and mentally incapable. Their life was one of utter destitution, unless they came from royal or wealthy upper-class families, or humble, loving families like Louis Braille's. Blind people who lived in rural areas and were lucky found work gardening or fruit picking, but most were peddlers and beggars who roamed the countryside. Blind people in cities worked as musicians, town criers, bell ringers, water carriers, and circus performers, but most were consigned to a life of begging or prostitution. Louis Braille's parents were literate, which was rare for villagers at that time. They were also down to earth, and they decided Louis would receive an education, encouraging him to participate in regular family and farm activities. Louis was a happy, precocious, and intelligent child. He learned the alphabet by feeling the shapes of letters made from upholstery nails that had been hammered into a wooden board. The town priest observed that Louis was eager and excited to learn, so he tutored him privately for a year, realizing that Louis's blindness was not an obstacle to receive an education. For 2 years, Louis attended school with regular children. Learning by listening and memorizing, he was one of the brightest students. When Louis Braille was 10 years old, he was accepted with a scholarship to a school for the blind in Paris. As difficult as it was for his parents to let go of their beloved son, and for Louis to leave his greatest source of strength, his loving family, Louis Braille left home for an opportunity to get a more rounded education at the Royal Institution for Blind Youth. Unfortunately, Louis left an idyllic and healthy farm life with fresh food and water for a school that was located in one of the least healthy sections of Paris, the building damp, unsanitary, and dangerous for both the health of the students and the teachers. Filthy water was piped from the Seine for cooking and washing. The students were allowed 1 bath per month, but still, this school was better than anything else available to blind children born in modest circumstances. Discipline in French schools was harsh. Children who misbehaved were locked in a dark closet, fed dry bread and water, or whipped. A typical school day for Louis Braille was 15 hours long. Intellectual subjects were taught orally with an emphasis on memorization. There were 3 sighted teachers for 90 blind students. The students were often trained to teach other students. Children were also taught manual trades like making baskets, knitting, or making ropes and fishing nets. As the majority of blind people could only make a living by playing instruments on the streets, music was a large part of their education. In spite of the circumstances, Louis Braille embraced his education. He was one of the most intelligent students, expressing his ideas clearly, winning awards for grammar, history, geometry, geography, and algebra. Louis also loved music, winning prizes for the cello and the piano, and becoming an accomplished organist. Louis had a charming and agreeable personality, making lifelong friends amongst his blind peers. When Louis was 14, he was made foreman of the slipper-making workshop. By 17, Louis taught several subjects to the other students while also giving piano lessons. 7 years earlier in 1820, when Louis was 11 years old, a former artillery captain, Charles Barbier, visited Louis' school to demonstrate a cryptographic code of night writing using embossed dots he hoped the army would adopt. In 1821, the school director allowed the children to experiment with Barbier's code. They quickly realized that reading raised dots was tactually easier than ambiguous lines and curves made up of letters, print letters in relief. But they also understood the fatal flaws in Barbier's system. There was no spelling, no grammar, no way to represent numbers, no way to become sighted, literate like sighted people. But it was Louis Braille, at 11 years old, who became obsessed and determined to find a user-friendly means of reading and writing for blind people. For the next 3 years, Louis worked during every free moment he had, taking Barbier's idea of raised dots and a code and completely redesigning it, creating his own unique invention. By the time Louis was 15, he had come up with the basic 6-cell Braille code we're familiar with today. When Louis was 16, his design was virtually complete, so brilliant and versatile it could be used for math and for learning and reading music in a way that had never been possible before. But Louis Braille wasn't satisfied. In the 19th century, the only way for blind people to write, if they were literate, was to scribble letters on paper using a wireframe to help them keep the lines in place. But they could never check their work. In Paris, there were maybe 3 or 4 blind people who could write. Louis Braille was one of them. But it was an incredibly difficult and tedious process that required extreme focus and concentration. The more common way to write was to use a scribe. But beyond the problem of privacy, it was a challenge to find scribes who were willing and literate. So Louis Braille set about solving the problem of writing for blind people. Louis conceived of what we now call dot matrix printing, employing the same principles used in modern electronics from computers to cell phones. For years, Louis worked on developing his idea. When he was 31 years old, with the help of a brilliant blind mechanic, they invented a machine that could write in Braille. When Louis was a teenager, he had already been suffering from what would be later diagnosed as tuberculosis. The entire time Louis Braille was working on his inventions, he was chronically sick, the result of malnutrition and the horrible, unsanitary conditions he'd been exposed to, both as a student and later as a teacher. In spite of his poor health, Louis Braille was happy. He cherished his friendships and loved his students. He was humble, kind, and generous, and he prized the opportunity to make a difference. With dogged determination, Louis Braille braved the obstacles that came his way, including the many-sided people who stood against the Braille code because of their own personal agendas, or because they couldn't see beyond their own limitations. But a consummate perfectionist, Louis Braille never ceased to strive for the highest quality he could achieve to bring his visions to light. After struggling with tuberculosis for over 2 decades, Louis Braille died at the young age of 43. He wasn't famous, and his Braille code wasn't official or accepted in the mainstream. Only the blind people who'd been exposed to it, his family, friends, and students, acknowledged his achievements. In spite of the opposition, Louis' lifelong invention spoke to the people he had lived to serve, those who have lost the gift of sight. It was blind people who embraced Louis' invention, championing it, refusing to forsake it, using it in secret if need be, because they could see what Louis Braille had seen. It was easy to learn, easy to read and write, and it gave them the key to literacy and to communicate with the rest of the world. The Braille code was not officially recognized in France until 2 years after Louis Braille's death. After that, the Braille code spread throughout Europe during the mid to late 19th century, but it wasn't until the 1930s that Braille was accepted in the English-speaking world, and the 1950s in the Spanish-speaking world. Today, Braille is used in almost every country in the world, and it has been adapted into almost every known language. The vision to do something incredible is not something you see with your eyes. It's something you imagine with your heart, you visualize with your mind, and you make happen with your hands. Behind every great revolutionary invention, there is a human being who first had a vision to change the world. And that's today's Happy Nugget. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, and subscribe. As always, I link below the video anything I recommend. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching. See you next time.